Hi, welcome to Walking the Path. I'm going to be talking to people who are on a spiritual journey, who want to share with us their experiences about what they've found on the journey. So if you're interested in spirituality and how you can embed it into your life, come and walk the path with me. I'm delighted to welcome this week Musa Askari, who is a friend of mine on Facebook, who I've been following his page. I've been stalking him for a little while, but I do like what he posts about. So welcome, Musa. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Very kind of you, Chris. Thank you.
You're not shy about your spirituality. You post about it quite regularly. So could I ask you, please, was this something you always grew up with? You always had ever since the beginning, or did you come to it later in life?
Well, good evening, Chris. Thank you again for inviting me. It's a difficult place, really, to answer that question in some ways, because it's like picking up a thread. You don't know where to pick it up from at the either end or somewhere in between. So it's a thread that's run throughout my life, really, consciously, probably since the age of 16, something like that. I'm in my early 50s now, and maybe unconsciously prior to that in just my outlook, I suppose. I couldn't be sure, but consciously since the age of 16, spirituality has been a very dominant factor in my life, and that's chiefly due to the influence of my own teacher and father and friend, late father, Sayyid Hassan Askari, who was an interfaith dialogue pioneer, Muslim interfaith dialogue pioneer from the early days of the interfaith movement in the late 60s and so forth. Which brought him to the West. We migrated to the UK when I was pretty young, and grew up in that environment. So, I would say consciously since my early mid to late, teens, as it were.
Okay, so you mentioned your late father as being a spiritual teacher and an interfaith minister. One of the things I ask all my guests is about the influences on their lives. So, and I know his influence has been great with you. Can you tell me in what way he influenced your spiritual practice?
I think I would begin with reflection, really, asking me indirectly or directly through the work that he was writing to reflect, to question, to not take things for granted, and to just be inquisitive about life, I suppose, which led me to quite early in those early years to start writing, poetry, sharing that with him and posting it to him and so forth. And that became a sort of tutelage, in exchanging ideas and thoughts. So very early, the idea of soul, the soul discourse, names such as Plotinus and Socrates and Plato from Western philosophy, and Rumi and Shams from Eastern philosophy, started to become very common in my thought processes. The influences was on reading, on reflection, and then that led me to for it to become like a way of life, really, Chris. There was no stopping and starting. The journey had begun.
Yeah, okay. Tell me, Musa, how you would define spirituality? Because obviously you're from an Eastern heritage and I'm from Western heritage. I'm just wondering about the differences that may be between the two. I think you're probably ideally placed to comment on this, having an interfaith background as well.
I went to a Catholic school in my upbringing in the UK, secondary school, while my father was teaching philosophy, Islamic studies, Islamic philosophy, and history of religion. He'd had a sociology background and moved into mysticism and philosophy of religion. So while he was doing that as his vocation and his own spiritual life, I went to the local school, which was a Catholic school. There was no question about going anywhere else. That was the school, that was local, okay. and we applied to that. All my parents did. And every week there was Mass. I became conscious of Christianity through Catholicism and practices of Catholicism, through the rituals of the Mass, of taking wine and bread, something that I didn't do. But the priest would often say, any who are non-Christian, as it were, to come forward and receive a blessing. And you could put your arm on your shoulder, as it would identify that's what you were asking. And I was sorely tempted on many occasions to just stand and walk. But I think I didn't do it. And I think I regret now I didn't try or go further, but I suppose it was teenage embarrassment and, being standing out. I wasn't, there weren't many Asian or Muslim children that I could identify with or see in the school, but it was good to observe it and hear it. So that was my intake in that level. But at home and throughout my upbringing, it was Islam, and it was the spirituality of Islam, of turning towards one God and oneness silently at night or through ritual prayer, and the scripture of the Quran, as it were. So for me, the Bible and the Quran were interchangeable. They were. They weren't, to be kept separate, as it were, in my thinking. And I think that was influenced chiefly by my father's outlook, because for him, scriptures talk to each other. There's a dialogue already happening, and the interfaith spirituality within Islam and the Quran sort of led that path quite easily for me. So yeah, I think the influences were there, but I wasn't manifestly outwardly practicing it. I would interchange, I would dip in and out of practices. So no, by no means was I an orthodox, as you would call it today, and outwardly practicing. But those practices are very powerful, as they are in Christianity.
Yes, indeed. It's very interesting to hear that you went to a Catholic school, because I know from experience in the Midlands that the church schools are the favoured ones for Muslims. If there is no Muslim type school, then they will send their children by preference to a church school, because that is where faith is taught. And there's also the thing about Islam and Christianity also being one with Judaism and the Abrahamic faiths, which I think is a point missed an awful lot. We have more in common than that which divides us as faiths.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that is very interesting. I can relate completely to the thing about the Mass, because I remember going to a Catholic Mass which was said in memory of, I don't know how to describe her, but I used to work for an organisation called the Richmond Fellowship, which works with adults with moderate to severe mental health problems. And she was a resident at one of the homes I worked at. And she was a terribly wounded woman and died, sadly. So I went to a Mass for her memory, and I too struggled with whether to go up and receive a blessing. And in the end, I didn't. And I regret that to this day, because I've had blessings from Muslim clerics and from Hindu clerics, from all other faiths. And they are truly powerful. It's some sort of, I forget what they have a name. I forget what the name is. In Reiki, I think we call it Reiju. It's a spiritual boost, is the only way I can describe it. And it really does give you a bit of a kick, if you like, into the sort of the next level. So I do regret missing that myself.
I think practices or witnessing practices of spiritual activity, either to the participant or to the observer, something overflows really, and it's like observing a river. Sometimes it could be flowing very smoothly and someone on the bank feels nothing from it but the beauty. But sometimes the river does burst the banks, and that is the spirituality of the person or the community, either in protest or in an act of prayer, can overspill, can have ramifications. For example, in the Quaker tradition, the silence, sitting in silence, deep silence, you're observing and yet you are part of it. You're doing both at the same time. That is very powerful on the occasions I've observed it or taken part. And that resonates very deeply in the Islamic tradition for me, in terms of Sufi mysticism, of deep remembrance, of prayer, of recital, which means speaking out loud. The Quran literally means recital, to recite, to say it out loud. But to sit quietly in contemplation is not unique to the Quaker faith tradition. It crosses over. So I think in those places, in those kinds of areas, there's a lot to be learned. And that to me is the threshold where spirituality becomes mystical. You're entering another area now. But to go back to your earlier point, if I recollect, about what spirituality means to me, I think it's important I say quite straightforwardly it means many things, but one of the most fundamental things it means to me is a relationship between the inner and the outer. Between the inner life, and I don't mean biologically inner, I mean your inner psyche, your thinking, beyond your mental activity, as it were, a contemplative state or level, your inner life, which is happening all the time, consciously or unconsciously, and your outward expression of that, and your outward relationship with the world. And for me, both are spiritual. The manifest world and the hidden world is part of one psychic whole, as it were. But the inner, for me, is always the higher. I don't mean the outward, the manifest nature and beauty is lower. I wouldn't call a branch lower to the trunk. I would just call it a manifestation, an expression, or an extension of it. So for me, spirituality is a relationship between your inner and outer life. And beyond that, overlaid with that, is a relationship with your identity and what you think about your identity as a person. And if I can be quite prescriptive for this moment, it would be straightforwardly as your name, your ethnicity, your religion, obviously, your background, your date of birth, your family history, all the things that give you a sense of identity, let alone place in terms of geography, but your sense of identity of who you think of yourself, even memories of pain and suffering and great elation, successful at work or education or otherwise. I think all of those identities added together, for me, we are something more than that also. And to go into that world or that kind of exchange, it involves A, becoming conscious of those identities. They're very difficult to become conscious of. Some are very automatic. And B, having become conscious of them, to know which ones to push forward and others to hold back in a dialogue. If I'm meeting somebody for the first time, automatically, I suppose now over the course of many years, I'm not inclined to explain everything about my background. I would rather that just came out naturally in a conversation. That for me is better than, so conversation and dialogue is also spiritual. I know I haven't answered your question emphatically, but because it's so difficult, but I've given something towards it.
Yes, I think you have. I can't remember what I mentioned in the episode I did for me of this one. But when I do the daily meditations on Facebook, I always start by saying that let us come into our I am presence, which is, to me, this is the part of us that is connected to everything else in the universe. And to me, that is the base. This is who we are, have been, and always will be. Hence my use of the word I am. And that is what I think is the spiritual part of us that exists outside of any identities we may have assumed in this lifetime. Do you follow that?
Yeah, I'm following you. Yeah, okay. I'm following you, but we may diverge a little bit.
Yeah, I would expect that.
But that's my little pet rabbit you can hear probably. Yeah, I think that first of all, I am is a profound statement. Saying it consciously is even more profound, and it's something you would say on pilgrimage also when you arrive at a certain point. Oh Lord, here I am and nothing else. Whatever I am is of yours and from you, as it were.
Yeah.
But this connection with spirituality, with nature, I go to it to this extent. And just to take a little sideward step, first of all, for me, I should have said earlier, this, when I say spiritual, I mean non-material. I'm very cautious or nervous about giving a material power, as it were. For me, spirituality is non-material, which goes on to talk about soul, as it were. But in terms of connecting with nature, which is material, yes, there is a sense of awe when you experience nature, or it experiences you or embraces you. For example, the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, before any revelation had even started, would be retreating into the desert. You've heard of that phrase,
yeah,
or that movement. And that was a withdrawing into nature to behold, the universe, as it were. Something deep is going on in the psyche and soul of any individual, let alone a prophet to be in time to come. So I think there is a great relationship with nature to be had all the time, and we are part of it. We cannot escape it, and our reverence or respect of nature has waned. And look at the climate crisis we're in. That I think is a direct relationship. Some people would call it, exploitation of capitalism and all kinds of things. But yes, spirituality is a definite component of the world. A despiritualization has led to a deconnection with nature and the climate crisis, definitely, in my opinion. But for me, spirituality supersedes or goes beyond the natural world. But bringing it to more intimate nature. And I was thinking about this a great deal before we had the conversation started this evening. If I want to connect with nature, before I even walk into a forest or go to a park, right now in my own home, in my own desk or table, all I have to do is concentrate upon my eye, my optic nerve, all my senses. These to me are nature. These tools allow me to connect with nature, to observe it, to inhale it, to take it in with my eyes, and what it does to me and what it means is something different in myriad ways to different people. But instantly, for me, I think about my five senses. I don't go looking for supernatural powers because I believe our five senses are absolutely remarkable. And obviously, because of impairment and disabilities, different human beings will have different capacities and powers of those senses. And I don't mean there's a superiority to it. I just mean the very ability to cognize and see and behold, and material things even, is a remarkable thing to me. For me, that is spiritual also. The sense of touch or the fragrance of something could send someone into an ecstatic state. It's possible. And we've heard about such things, I'm sure. So yeah, I just wanted to overlay our conversation with that sense of a deeper mystical dimension.
Yes, indeed. Yes. And so I'll add to that, because I did do a bit of stalking of you. Okay. I know you have a website which is about spiritual humanism. Could you tell me more about that, please? I haven't had a chance to sort of go into it in depth, but I saw that and I thought, well, that's a very interesting concept. I must remember to ask Musa about that tonight. So please explain what your concept of spiritual humanism is.
Yeah, it's my father's, really. So there is a book he co-wrote called Towards a Spiritual Humanism. I have it here to show you.
Okay.
But the website is a dedication to him, the blog. Yeah. It contains his writings, his work, my own writings and reflections and interviews I've done with people. So spiritual human is a short form of spiritual humanism. But the human, i.e. ourselves, I would consider ourselves not only to be material beings and sociological beings and religious beings, but spiritual beings and spiritual humanism. So, spiritual human is a reflection of that in terms of the website, but also as an entity that we are spiritual. And spiritual humanism is a coalescence of, or a coalescing of ideas where people of interfaith spirituality and secular spirituality should dialogue and find a way to coexist in terms of ideas and continue talking to each other. So spiritual humanism is a plea to people of faith and non-faith who have calls for justice and harmony and peace in the world to collaborate and work together consciously. And spiritual humanism, very importantly, not only with that, seeks to promote interfaith dialogue beyond a mere exchange of information about religious studies, as it were. You could do in school or in a college or university. We could do that ourselves through self-study. But interfaith dialogue in terms of human beings conversing with each other to such an extent where dialogue becomes a door to transformation. And you become vulnerable. You are willing to transform yourself with the witness of the other who has a different tradition and different outlook. It may be a glimmer, it may be a flicker, but there is something. So for me, dialogue is that potentiality. And this is me basically echoing or channeling my own father's words and thoughts. So I claim no originality about it whatsoever. But it's an experience of working with him and talking with him and observing him and my own work in that personally. So for me, dialogue is that, and spiritual humanism is unashamedly promoting that between individuals, saying, don't just meet face to face, but meet being to being, as it were, and look to abandon things that you held tightly because of the witness of the other person who gives you something different or a different perspective, not just a different point of view, but you're willing to be transformed. And that is wholesome, positively transformed. Mm-hmm. The other dimension of spiritual humanism is a categorical affirmation of the soul discourse, dialogue about soul, to say that we are not only materially sitting here, but also we are as souls sitting here, invisibly, impartable, intangible, immaterial. I look for no scientific evidence of it because the proofs that I'm looking for are invisible, intangible also. And just to sort of connect that, because I thought we may go in this direction, I have a quote, if you allow me to read, from my own father's writings, which basically goes to the conversation we're having here. So I thought I'll pick something that you and I could relate to.
Yes.
It reads like this, and it's on the chapter that he's dialogue. The book is a dialogue between two individuals, and the chapter is a discourse on soul. So one of his sections concludes with this. And he says, this is Hassan Askari, in my understanding, for two human beings to communicate, we need a common ground of being. And this common ground of being is not metaphysical in the sense of God or the Godhead, but in the sense of principles which are immanently available between two human beings. Therefore, for interpersonal communication, we need an ontological parity which transcends social hierarchy, which transcends class, which transcends race, which transcends disparity of power and even knowledge. What is the ontological ground of parity between, say, a psychiatrist and a patient, between a teacher and a pupil, between a humanist and a believer, between a skeptic and a man who is convinced of what he believes? And he concludes, so irrespective of the contents of consciousness, there should be a principle which holds two human beings together. That principle is of the soul, which is both one and diverse between them. We need the idea of soul to resolve the mystery of dialogue between God and man and woman. So we need the same idea to explain self-communication and communication between two human beings, a principle which is both in them and which transcends them. End quote. And I would just add to that. So for example, I'm sitting here in this room, in this location, and Chris, you are sitting there. We are not physically together, but yet there is a sense of togetherness temporarily,
Yes.
And the technology is allowing us to have a window into that. In fact, I would go further and say that sense of togetherness was invisibly there, which led us to talk to us tonight to have an invitation for dialogue or a sense of togetherness. So that intangible togetherness has been manifested in this. And I'm just using that as an example, but I do mean that sincerely, that without this sense of togetherness, how are we even talking between us, is the way I would put it.
Yeah, the way I put it, and this every time I do this interview, it shows me that it's the right thing. The modern phrase, I guess, is the vibe attracts the tribe. Everybody that I've spoken to, I speak to them because of the connection that existed beforehand. Now, some people from the Western tradition might call it a soul family. Other people might say that it's because we're part of the one overarching great soul, which I think was one of the ideas that came out of that reading. I guess it's called the Atma, isn't it? The
Yeah.
great soul of the universe. And when we die, we return to that great soul. That's another system of thought. But my vibe for this podcast has attracted the tribe of people that tend to agree with me, and I do find that I end up agreeing with what people say. Amazingly enough, because why is that? I'm not here for an argument. I might be an Aries and I love arguing, but I'm not here to argue. And yet people are free to do that if they wish, and I'm free to disagree with them, and they're free to disagree with me. And I always find that we agree.
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Atma there, which is the Vedantic tradition, the Sanskrit word for soul. And in the Islamic tradition, the word for soul would be Ruh. One thing I omitted, because it's just become automatic in my thinking or unconscious, and I should become more conscious of it, is part of my upbringing has been the background in which I grew up, which is the Indian tradition. I was born in India. I still have very strong and clear memories of my early childhood there, and returning many times in the intervening years. You see, in India, you've got multi-faith, at a level that's, almost unseen in many places. You've got many traditions, many faiths, many languages, and cultures interweaving each other. Interfaith spirituality is a way of life in India generally, although in recent years, with news that we hear of terrible polarization, and I won't say further than that at this moment, but we can all look into the news. It's quite distressing. And obviously, even despite that heritage, the conflict and tensions that went on in India due to partition and what led to that and what led after that is tragic, really. So my father said he had a choice to go to Pakistan after partition, and he chose to remain in India as a Muslim in a society was not predominantly Muslim, because diversity and interfaith was staring him in the face, and he had to be there. There was no other choice, and he accepted that diversity. And I'm so glad he did, because that translated into my life.
Yes.
Poured into it. So it continued here when we moved here to the UK, because the UK is very diverse, and I'm glad about that.
Yes. Talking about diversity of faith, well, as you know, I'm a teaching Reiki master, and what part of the studies I undertook in Reiki showed me about Japan and where it originates from. And it is possible there for one person to have three faiths, and none of them clash with each other. They could be a nominal Christian, if you like, and do the Christian ceremonies, the baptisms and marriage and funerals, all as Christians. They can do the ancestor worship of Shinto, the ancestors, which is fine, or they can adhere to the sayings of Confucius. All three different belief systems in one person. And to us in the West, that is just not done. If you want to do things like that, you can't do that. You have to pick a faith or none. So that was something that brought me a completely different perspective. I suppose Christians would say, that they're picking and choosing. They're taking the best bits from all of them. And I thought to myself, well, why not? And there are other religions like Santeria in South America, which seems to be a blend of Catholicism and the animism of them that was there beforehand. So
I think one of the problems with that eclectic approach is the fear is from the orthodoxy, you could say, of any particular tradition is it could be seen as a mark of disrespect, saying you are diluting our seriousness. And there's something to be said for that to some extent, I'm sure. And also the lack, the acquisition could be in return. Your discipline is not as serious as someone who's following a particular singular approach. So I think that there are critiques that for me, the issue would be the individual who is doing that, i.e., dipping in and out of different traditions and learn what is the purpose of their quest. Are they on a quest, or is it simply a superficial lifestyle choice? And I think it's very important to be critical of that, because if it is a lifestyle choice, then you err into areas of cultural appropriation, which can be very disrespectful. But if it is a quest of spirituality, of deep longing, that what they're searching for, they see traces of the same truth appearing in different flashes, then I think it is a perfectly, innerly legitimate conversion. See, I'm very skeptical, or I can be skeptical, of outward conversions from one religion to another. I'm not as much interested, and again, this is from my father's influence, in whose numbers are going up and whose numbers are going down in terms of number of followers of a faith. X 1.7 billion, 2 billion, 5, 300 million, whatever it is. For me, spirituality is not a numbers game. It's a more singular approach to universal truth that's accessible to all, as a general loose way. Now, someone listening to this conversation that we're having here would say, this is so vague, I'm getting nothing from it. And I say, welcome to spirituality, because that is, there's nothing wrong with uncertainty. Because if the scientific endeavor, as it is, and as the rational endeavor is to be doubtful, to use doubt in a creative way, to quest for scientific truth and explore and make life better materially, then I'm equally using doubt, self-doubt, spiritual self-doubt, for greater understanding. I see no reason to hesitate. I don't think doubt is a problem. I think, how do you challenge that doubt? How do you move forward with it? Doubt is a good tool, even in religious, under religious dogmatic conditions, doubt is your escape route. If things are so dogmatic and you have so rigidness, and there's no inner spirituality, it's just completely outward manifestation, one after another, literal following. There are problems with that psychologically for any individual who wants to walk out of it. So doubt is an escape, is a release valve, an escape clause, and hopefully you get support to explore that.
I think you're quite right. Spirituality is, for me, primarily an individual thing. And that's why, hence the title of the podcast, Walking the Path, because as I say to my students, this is your path and you must walk it. I can only give you signposts or instant tips or things to look at. In the end, what they make of their spiritual life is up to them. And this is one reason why I started the podcast, because I wanted my students and the followers to get as many varied perspectives on the spiritual path as they could, so they could see what there is out there for them. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, Musa, was what are you currently looking at on your spiritual path? What is developing for you, if you like? We've talked about how you got to this point, more or less. How do you see your path panning out in the future?
That's a very, very important question, and I'm somewhat nervous to answer it in one sense. Just before I only dip my toe into that question, I'll explain why briefly in a minute. Just to go back a little bit to the point you made a moment ago about telling your students it's your path, you must find your way. I think that, I would go along with that, but with one rider, which is the tradition I know about, and the spirituality which gives me inspiration also, is the Sufi mystical tradition of Islam. And in that tradition, whatever guises it comes in, generally a novice who is not fully developed as a teacher or a master in their own right are looking for teachers. Much like a samurai would look for a greater samurai to teach and then take their own path.
Yeah.
So eventually the samurai must go on their own way. You know, the end of The Seven Samurai, the famous movie from Kurosawa,
Yeah.
they're all, but they come together. They act together, and then some perish, and the ones that survive, they don't stay together. They go back on their own singular path. And obviously that movie was so influential. It influenced, you know, Western movie in many ways, and still does. But so the samurai tradition, you know, the mystical tradition leans into that. But the Sufi tradition is you are looking for a guide. And you may stay with that guide for many years, or when you have outlived the teachings of that guide, the guide will say to you, I can offer you no more. I mean, there is even in a teacher, there's inner humility saying, I can only take you so far.
Yes.
And there's no arrogance about that. You now need to move on and find another teacher.
Yes.
And the wandering begins again, as it were. The homelessness begins again. It may be you're living an outwardly absolutely normal life, quote unquote. You're going to work, you're doing your job, you're earning your money. I'm not saying you're escaping to the hills, but in some people, you know, in prior times would leave their homes and travel and look for teachers. Same thing with the Hindu tradition, the Vedantic tradition, as Buddha did, leaving his princely estate, looking for a teacher, eventually finding that he was always the higher teacher of the one he met, and so on. Until his final teacher was Mother Earth, when he put his hands on the grounds under the Bodhi tree and so forth.
Yes.
But equally, or in parallel, in that same continent, in that same place, Islam has flourished, where a Sufi novice will look for a teacher, and the teacher will take them so far. And then say, as you said, you find your own way. So there is this coming together and then separating with greater knowledge and coming together again. For me, I was very, very fortunate. I didn't have to take one step outside my house. You know, and my teacher was already there.
Yes.
The journey I had to, and forgive my, forgive my indulgence in saying that in that way, but yeah, my teacher was already there. I was born into the family, and here we go. So I feel very. I've never shared this with anyone, so Chris, maybe it's because of our dialogue, I can feel freely to say it. But I have been saved from much wanderings in the past by having, you know. Now there were other people who met my father who'd been on their own particular journey and came across him, and you know, I observed. In fact, I learned a lot from him to some degree, a lot more than engaging in dialogue with my father, than by, you know, obviously by observing him in dialogue with other people, whether he was giving lectures or students used to visit our house, or I used to see him at university, or wherever. I learned a lot just by listening and observing him interacting and other people interacting with him. In a way, I became a student, also a stranger. There were moments where I became a stranger in front of him, and that was quite frightening. In terms of just, not in conversation, but in I don't know who this person is. I've known him all my life. I know his face, I know his voice, but the things he's saying, never heard him say, you know, who. So there's a mystery that comes about even in familiarity, and that for me is a really good breakthrough. So personally, I was saved a lot of time in that. And going forward, coming to your question, I don't know is my honest answer. And whatever it is, I hope I am up to it.
I think that's a very good answer, actually, because it indicates that you're open to whatever is coming to you. Because
inshallah, as they say.
I do feel that the universe provides the lessons, you know, that we need in order to ascend or develop whatever word you want to use. But
I think what's important to me is I'm conscious not to disappear into such abstractness where I'm ignoring the pains of the world generally day to day. You know, I think it's an indulgence that to some extent we can't afford at this moment in time. Yes, in your own private reflection, in your own private silence, you withdraw from the world. In Islam, the Quran encourages you to, outside of the structures of formal prayer, to find that solitude in the middle of the night and remember God. And that could be in silence. It may not even be uttering a prayer or a verse from the Quran or whatever. And so there is that encouragement to, there's no compulsion in religion, as Islam says, and I wish that was remembered a lot more.
Yeah.
But there is that encouragement to find your own solitude and escape from the world or the troubles of the world. We all need that.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be an overindulgence par excellence for me to take that solitude back to the next morning when I have to do my job and not engage, or when I turn on the news or walk about my community when I'm able to walk about after the pandemic, God willing, to not notice the food bank queue, or to not notice key workers who are now, the great spiritual teachers of our time, in one sense, of their own sacrifice. Now, they don't want to be called heroes, they just want to be respected, and so be. But we should notice the injustices in the world. We should notice the people who are having poor conditions in terms of their day-to-day work, and not so far abandon ourselves from the world to think nothing to do with me. And then what does this mystical connection with the rest of humanity really mean if we cannot engage and deal with social justice and social suffering? And one last thing I would say, and I'm conscious I do want to say it because of the moment in time that we're talking. I think if we believe in a universal spirituality, a greater interconnectedness through all the outward identities for a more peaceful world, if there is a key point to spirituality, which is to make the world more peaceful, then I think that for me personally, the apex of that is that unity and that greater goodness. You have to really take all the way to the top in worldly affairs to some extent and question the very existence of something that can destroy humanity in a flash. Yes. And I'm talking about the nuclear weapon. And if you're following me as you are on social media, I've been commenting on that lately, at the horror of that. Yeah. That's the unconscious terror we sort of live under, and we never look in the face of it because we're told to fear the other. Well, I think that is the complete antithesis of the universal spirituality that you and I are hoping for or praying for, along with millions of others across the planet, that such a weapon exists. I'm not going to the politics of it or the geopolitics, which is another issue. But something is there right now in our world as we're talking, where a food bank exists and nuclear weapon silos exist. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't make sense to me.
No.
It doesn't chime with my spirituality whatsoever.
No.
Forgive me, sorry.
No, you're right. I know we share a lot of the same political viewpoints, but I would just, before we do close up, I would just feature something that from my own childhood that I was taught a hymn. And I only remember one line of it, but it has stayed with me my whole life. And that line is, God has no hands but your hands. And we have to, if spirituality means anything to us as people, we have to act on it. It has to guide what we do in our lives. In whatever way, whatever manifestation that is. And if spirituality is to bring about peace to the world or to improve the world in whatever way, then the only way it's going to happen is if we do it.
Indeed, yeah. And I think that act of solidarity, or the act of dealing with those injustices through good works, or challenging it or protesting against it, the person standing next to you in that protest, it makes no difference to me who they believe in or which faith they follow, or none. We're both standing there for against the same injustice. And for me, for that moment, at that instant, that is humanity. That is more than enough. What and then we go our separate ways, and re-meet again. I am worried, if I'm honest with you, Chris, about, it's a criticism of spirituality, I suppose, generally. And this is not particularly isolated to the West or just across the world, I suppose, is this inclination towards a lifestyle choice, of an accessory to everything else that you do. Here's mindfulness. Let's commercialize mindfulness. I worry about that. And also, because I think that's an abuse of mindfulness and how it started. From a professor I was speaking to recently, and who should get the credit for it. Hopefully, when I can get to speak to him again, I'll publicize it. But it started in Burma or Myanmar, in Burma, I think, of how the practice was shared and then commercialized and put into the West. So I'm very worried about that. But I'm also worried about this sense of, well, I'm on a spiritual path. The world's injustices, that's my escape from it. That's how I psychologically and mentally deal with the problems all around me. And I respect that as an individual. Okay. But I think anyone who's practicing any spirituality of whatever degree, to whatever intensity, my very desperate plea is to engage with the social issues of the day, climate change, to injustices of inequalities of wealth and income. Because all the great teachers, whoever that we're learning from, would not be supportive of this. I'm pretty sure of that. I say that with some degree of confidence. I just wanted to get that across because we need to act, and take part in civil society. I'm not saying they're not. I'm not saying people who are on a spiritual path are not doing that. But there is this tendency I've noticed over the years across the world from stuff I've seen and engagements I've had of a parallel existence, where it's that can carry on. But the people that marched at Clapham Common recently, and the people that marched or protested at the vigil recently against that injustice and remembering a lady who passed away tragically, and also the people who protested, for in the 80s, I think, against the CND protests against the nuclear weapon. It's all part of one psychic unity to me.
Yes.
I hope. Yes. That's what I hope. That's my next step.
Yes.
Continue to hope.
Okay. Thank you, Musa. I think we will leave it there, but thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been fascinating, and you never know, we may do this again. Bless you. Namaste.
Thank you.
We've come to the end of the path for today. If you'd like to support the podcast by sponsoring it, please get in touch, or you can visit our website www.amethystcentre.com or our Patreon or Facebook page for Walking the Path. See you next time.